Hi, Chag Samech, and welcome back to Vlog Chag, night number 5. I can't believe it. I feel like I've made so many of these, but we're only at 5, and yet also we are somehow more than halfway through. It's pretty bananas. Also, I apologize for any cat noises. The shades are open, and so light is very exciting. You'd think that we didn't buy them toys and things because the light is just, and they can't just sleep in it like normal cats. They have to scream at it. It must be screamed at. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking about the insertion of Jewish characters into the Christmas episodes of a lot of shows, and I'm going to say, I'm actually pro-Christmas episode. I love Christmas media. I think most of the time it's not super religious, it's just about like cultural Christmas, which is kind of its own thing. Most of the time Christmas episodes don't emphasize, the birth of Jesus. It's about like, family and the holidays and like enjoying time together. And I think that that's like really nice. And I think holiday movies in general are fun because like everybody kind of understands the premise and like there's an assignment. You can choose to fulfill it or not. A lot of movies aren't great. Like there are a lot of really bad holiday movies out there. I mean, Hallmark produces like 100 of them a year, so you have to like assume that some of them aren't like the best quality. It's kind of just a saturation problem. Like we don't need 15 Christmas movies a year. Maybe 2 is good. Especially because like remaking the same one over and over again is kind of a joke. Like, oh, big time lawyer goes back to small town, finds that she was wrong to leave and her true passion is baking. I think that's a tweet that I saw. I spend way too much time on Twitter. I gotta get away from that. Fozzie's like, you can get away from that by petting me. Too much time spent on the Twitter. Not enough time spent on petting the gray baby. Oh God, you're everywhere. I shouldn't have worn a black sweater in this one. I should have immediately known that you would come over and just get your fur all over it. He's a shutting machine. I have no real problem with Christmas episodes kind of featuring Jewish characters because it's realistic. Many friend groups have like a Jewish person in them when most people are Christian, just because that's how the demographics, at least in the US, look. Most people are Christian, or at least culturally Christian, and some people are of minority faith. They're Muslims or Jews or Jains or Buddhists, most of whom do not celebrate Christmas, although I know a lot of people who are American just kind of celebrate Christmas because they're like, nah, why not? We'll have a tree, we'll have presents. The problem that a lot of people have with Christmas episodes or holiday episodes just featuring like the token Jew is that it's not like good representation. A lot of the time you'll only find out that a character is Jewish in the holiday episode when someone's like, what are you doing for Christmas? And they're like, eating Chinese food because I'm Jewish. And like, while that should be a moment for the Christian character to be like, oh, I didn't know, I should recognize that I am like coming from a place of privilege on this and think about like why I didn't know this about someone who I'm supposedly close to. It's usually just like, oh, wow, you don't talk about that. So I think in a lot of narratives, that could be a moment where the character like reckons with their usually whiteness and thinks about like, oh, how can I be a good friend to my friend this holiday and make them feel welcome despite like the differing religious traditions we espouse. It's usually just like, oh, you never mentioned that before. And the Jewish character will then say like, oh, well, I don't really do that much, so that they're not really that Jewish. Because as I've said a lot on this show, an acceptable Jew is one who is not actually Jewish, who's just kind of Jewish adjacent. Like, you can be Jewish as long as you don't do anything inconvenient, like keep kosher, or want to marry another Jewish person, or want to raise your children Jewish. Like, you can be Jewish as long as you're not too Jewish. And I've had that like conversation with a lot of people who are like, oh, but are you like Jewish or are you Jewish? Which is like really offensive. Like it's basically saying like, oh, don't be too different or else you're not acceptable to me. And a lot of the time I can tell that the people who write these characters as just being like, oh yeah, I do practice a little bit, but I don't keep kosher or anything like that. These people are writing from a perspective of coming from either a semi-observant or like not super observant Jewish household, where they're just kind of like keep some of the cultural norms. And that's fine, but like that shouldn't be the only representation on TV. From what I've seen on TV, with few exceptions, the kind of Jews you see on TV are either the ultra-Orthodox or regular standard issue Reform Jews. And there's nothing wrong with either of those groups being represented on TV. I think that's really important. There's actually an episode of Two Broke Girls, one of the weirdest comedies to ever be on television. I actually did enjoy it at the time, although a lot of the jokes are bad and there's some real racism there. But on the show, there's an episode where the characters are baking cupcakes for an Orthodox event, and they do have to do it with entirely new stuff because their implements aren't kosher. But there are a couple problems with the episode. Firstly, that if you live in New York, there are kosher bakeries you can buy from. You don't need to like go to these cupcake manufacturers. There are a lot of kosher bakeries in New York. Secondly, you can't just like bake with kosher implements. You have to cook in a kosher kitchen. And there are different levels of kashrut, but the people on this show were glatt kosher, which means like, you know, the highest level, different sets of dishes, no meat and milk together at all, no pork, no shellfish, no, like there's like specific rules about kashrut that different groups follow. A lot of people will bend the rules, especially in places where it's difficult to get kosher meat. In general, being accepting and loving of all of our Jewish siblings is really important, and respecting how their traditions are different than ours, as long as they're not hurting anyone, is the thing to do. And on these shows, most of the time, the Jew is the afterthought. It's kind of like having the one black friend, like the one Jewish friend. They're never the main character. Particularly with characters like Willow Rosenberg on Buffy, she can kind of go both ways. Like there is a time when she's hammering up a cross in her room to protect her from vampires, where she's like, Ira Rosenberg's daughter probably should not be doing this. Which is funny. Like it's funny to remind her like, oh yeah, she is Jewish. Hanging across in her room is definitely weird. But it doesn't really get brought up often, which we can assume to mean that she is just kind of like culturally Jewish and doesn't celebrate a lot of the holidays. But like it doesn't have to be a big thing. There can just be a day on the fall schedule where it's like, oh, Willow's not here today. Oh, it's Yom Kippur. She's home from school today. She gets really cranky when she can't eat. Like there are a lot of opportunities to make your Jewish characters authentically Jewish, and when people don't take that opportunity, it strikes me as incredibly lazy. Not just because there aren't Jews in the room, because there are a lot of Jews in entertainment, right? Frequently, even the actors are Jewish. But it's disappointing when the time to explore that nuance isn't had. And like, it is particularly poignant when the time you find out a character is Jewish is during a holiday episode, and that's one of the only times it's mentioned. A particularly egregious version of this is on House, when House's best friend Wilson is Jewish. It's mentioned in the first episode, which I will give them credit for, but later on it only comes up sporadically. I also don't love that he plays into the stereotype of like the passive Jewish man. There are a lot of really negative stereotypes in television and in media about Jewish men, and a lot more about Jewish women because, you know, sexism's gonna sexism, but about Jewish men specifically, that they're kind of like, you know, led around by the women in their lives and passive and unattractive. And while Wilson is seen in the show as like, you know, an attractive significant other, he's also kind of like powerless in the face of more like driven people. He's like the weak Jewish man, which isn't a great portrayal. But like the worst part of it is that he would not have been the most realistic character to have been Jewish. Gregory House seems like a pretty Jewish person. And while it's not explored in a lot of media, drug addiction is actually pretty prevalent in a lot of diasporic Jewish communities due to generational trauma and a lot of other genetic factors. And I don't even know if on the show Lisa Cuddy is supposed to be Jewish, but her portrayer certainly is. And there's certainly a lot of times when House sexualizes her, talks in Yiddish around her, things like that. So she's probably coded as Jewish without being canonically Jewish, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, especially because like the actual actress portraying her as Jewish and could do so in an honest way. But the character of Lisa Cuddy is also negatively stereotyped as a Jewish woman. She's an uptight Jewish professional who can't keep a man and desperately wants a baby. That's pretty negatively stereotypical. My main point here is that the portrayals of Jews on television have a long way to go, and the Christmas episode in particular is a problem. Friends supposedly has mostly Jewish main characters. Rachel Green is highly coded as Jewish, but never explicitly referred to as such, and Monica and Ross are canonically Jewish, but while Ross is allowed to be Jewish as the, as we've said, undesirable passive Jewish man, Monica isn't allowed to be Jewish because she has to be a desirable romantic other. There are a lot of problems with that are for another day, but what I find particularly striking is that Ross is the only like really visibly Jewish character on the show, and he is by far the worst. And even when Monica and Chandler get married, it's with a priest, despite the fact that she's Jewish and their children would be. Ross is the worst, and he amplifies all of the negative stereotypes of Jewish men. The main point is that there's nothing wrong with mentioning that your characters are from a minority religion in a holiday episode, but it shouldn't be the only time it comes up. And it really shouldn't define the character in only that one way. Hanukkah isn't like an unimportant holiday. A lot of people will be like, Hanukkah's the only holiday that people know and it's not important. It's important. It has its place. People want to feel as though they're being inclusive without actually learning anything, and Hanukkah is a really great way to do that. Anyway, thanks for watching our 5th vlog Chag video, night number 5, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow when I'll be exploring some Hanukkah media, ? You'll see what I mean then. Happy Hanukkah, Chag Sameach, and have a great night. I will see you all tomorrow. Bye!